Is that it?
Anybody else? All right. Thank you, Mr. Wilbanks. We appreciate it. And if you, I don't know if you're going to be around, but if you have any more questions, talk with him. Now, we have about 4 or 5 more things, but I'm going to ask them to move on and just stay to the point. But the next item on our agenda is Clara Keith. Is Clara here? Is going to, now listen very carefully, going to talk to us about title and competitive federal grants. And Clara, we just want to talk about what federal grants there and the monies. And so if you go at this time. Do we have a handout on that? All right, good. All right.
Chairman Coleman, Chairman Rogers, committee members, I have been asked to provide this committee with a high-level overview of the federal grants we receive at the Department of Education that may particularly impact standards and, in some instances, the flexibility waiver that we have from No Child Left Behind. I think it's important for you to know that the federal government generally provides grants to states in one of 2 ways. One is by formula, and the other is states must compete for funds through an application process. As I go through this presentation, I think you will see why that is important. First, I want to talk to you about formula grants. Formula grants use formulas that are generally determined by Congress and are calculated by the U.S. Department of Education. The formula is generally based on a state's per capita income and or the percent of children in poverty and or the number or the percent of children in the target population. For example, the number of special education students or the number of children in poverty. The grants are typically sent to the state on behalf of local school districts, and then the state allocates those funds to the local school district. The state is then required to notify the local school district about the allocation, or budget, if you will, how the funds are to be used, and how the state will actually monitor those grants. There are 3 major types of grants that I want to mention today. There are many, many more, but there are really 3 major grants that we receive at the Department of Education. They are the grants under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. You may hear this as No Child Left Behind. You may hear this as Title I. Title IIA came up a few minutes ago. You may hear it as programs for poverty children. The Carl D. Perkins Vocational and Technical, or you may hear this as CTAE, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and this is referring to special education. Dr. Reichrath talked a little bit about the waiver. I want you to know that states are still bound by the legislation in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act or by the waiver. Georgia's waiver, or our flexibility waiver, is about the accountability requirements in No Child Left Behind. So Georgia submitted an application or a state plan, and actually a state plan, on how our funds would be used to support the goals of the Act. I think it is very important for me to share with you exactly the language around the development of the plan. So if you will, the language comes right out of the legislation. Any state desiring to receive a grant under this part has to submit a plan to the Secretary, and that is the Secretary of Education at the U.S. Department of Education. The plan has to be developed in consultation with local school districts, teachers, principals, pupil services personnel, administrators, including administrators of programs that are described in other pieces of this legislation, and also in consultation with IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Act, Carl D. Perkins, and Head Start, and the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act. The legislation also required all states to develop challenging academic standards. We get asked quite often about this requirement. What is the federal government doing in our business about standards? Why will we not be able to change our standards? How do we protect our classrooms? How can we make sure that we teach exactly what we want to teach? I think it's important for me to also read you language around the development of the standards. Each state plan shall demonstrate that the state has adopted challenging academic content standards and challenging student academic standards. And this part is really important, except that a state shall not be required to submit such standards to the Secretary. I also think it's important for you to know that the law says nothing in this part shall prohibit a state from revising any standard adopted under this law or after the date of the enactment of No Child Left Behind of 2001. And my last point here on this slide is that these funds, mostly for the No Child Left Behind Act, are for children in high poverty schools and for those students that are at risk of not graduating. I wanted to also share with you the fiscal impact on local school districts. And I'm talking now particularly about Title I Part A alone, and this is the major act in No Child Left Behind. In FY14, we received at the Department of Education on behalf of local school districts about $460 million. In FY15, we received about $481 million. If you actually consider all the funds that we get from the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or you may know it as No Child Left Behind or Title programs, the IDEA Act and Perkins, it would be just over $1 billion per year. These are supplemental funds, and I think that's important as well. It means that local school districts can hire additional staff at their high poverty schools. They can get tutoring for at-risk students. They can purchase additional aids for students and for their teachers. They can hire staff to actually work with parents to make sure that they are more engaged with their students' education. The other part that I have to make sure that I mention is that these funds are supplemental to what the state and the local school district would already provide to the schools. These funds are in addition to the financial commitment that is made at the state and at the school level. This requirement helps to make sure that these funds are used for our most needy children. Now I want to move to competitive grants. Competitive grants have very specific criteria, and they normally follow the reform agenda of the U.S. Department of Education. The U.S. Department of Education provides states with the opportunity to compete for additional funds based on specific criteria. Competitive grants reflect the education reform, as I mentioned, of the U.S. Department of Education. The amount of the funds may vary, and they are actually determined by the application criteria. The application includes all of the requirements for submitting or applying for the grant funds. One important thing to remember, though, is that the criteria must align with the federal law. Two very familiar competitive grants that you may be familiar with are Striving Readers and the Race to the Top grant. Submitting an application for a competitive grant is voluntary. A state will make a determination if it believes that the additional funds that they can apply for voluntarily meets its own educational reform agenda. In addition, the state has an opportunity to actually review the application before the application becomes available to the public. That is done through the Federal Register. So a state has an opportunity to determine if a competitive grant can, or actually if the state is willing to accept the assurances around the federal grant. Dr. Susan Andrews will be discussing Georgia's Race to the Top grant, and I think her comments will provide you with an excellent example of how this comes into play through by the Race to the Top application. And so those are my comments. I had many other comments that I could make about federal
Let me ask you something. You've hit on these grants. I think you've left out a grant, a federal involvement that's tremendous, lunch services.
Yes,
I
absolutely.
mean, that's huge. Are you
That
going to
is-
touch that? Are you going to talk on that one?
I had not planned to talk about that, but we do also get a lot of money from the Department of Agriculture for free and for lunches that are provided and supplemented.
That's more than Title I, wouldn't you think?
That is more than Title I. I am not the expert on the food services part, but I know that there is a staff person at the Department of Education.
And is it also not true that special ed included in this is not either, is it? I know the Title I is, but there's other special ed money too.
There, I remember I mentioned
Yeah.
in my presentation
Yeah.
that the three that I talked about was the
Right.
No Child Left Behind
Right.
and IDEA that gets its own separate allocation.
Right.
But that is a formula. It's based on
Right.
the number of special education students that we may have. That
Could you
that-
say what percentage of federal money comes to the state, would you say?
That's not my area of expertise.
anyone
That
there
would be
can
a
answer
Scott
that?
Austinson.
Is it, anyone can answer that for us? What percentage of monies would you say? Is it 10% of the state's budget that we put out there? Is it 20% federal money? John, Dr. Barnes?
If you consider that our annual budget
Yeah.
is approximately $8 billion a year, $1 billion of that is federal dollars.
Okay.
Okay.
And that includes food service and all the other. Or anyone else have any questions?
Yeah.
Dr. Bosa?
Well, I just want to provide some local context for you since you asked the question about
Right,
food
I
nutrition.
appreciate that. We were talking about that at lunch
Yeah.
today, so that's good.
So in Fulton County, for example, our general operating budget is about $815 million, and we receive $71.5 million in USDA funding, which is considered food and nutrition. I'd like to add that to a topic that we discuss at some point. I know Common Core has been a topic of discussion, but for us in Fulton County, with a fast-growing free and reduced lunch population, a lot of the stringent policies that have been put in place at the federal government are causing local issues where kids are not eating the food that we're providing. They're dumping them into the garbage cans. This is not anecdotal. We measure that, and we've seen an increased number of that. We also have the opposite effect, which is we've limited the amount of caloric intake, and so some of your larger high school athletes, football players, et cetera, are saying they're not getting enough food because the number of calories that we provide for them are too low. So it's a big challenge, and I think it's one worth discussing. It's also become part of a national movement through the AASA, which is an association for school leaders and superintendents. We've got a real issue with that, and it might be worth discussing here.
That's something that's, Courtney, if you could, just put that down, could you? Yeah. Anything else that you'd like to? Oh, I'm sorry, Representative Glanton.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Part of the charge for this committee is to determine the long-term commitments that the state has as a result of implementing federal programs. I use, for example, the nutrition program that the chairman talked about. With that comes federal compliance standards and how and what our children eat and when they eat it. In regards to these grants, understanding that we don't have to pay them back, what is the long-term obligation of any particular grant you can think of from the federal government that is here for us for the X amount of money or X amount of years, and then the state now has an obligation for receiving that money to continue that process at the expense of the state?
Yes, okay, that is an excellent question. And so that's why I started my presentation with there are two types of grants. We have the formula grants and we have the competitive grants.
Right.
If it's a competitive grant, that's where you have most of the conversation around sustainability, and then the state therefore must decide what amount of that work or those funds that it would like to continue. There are some grants that have matching requirements as well. So if you get the federal money, then you have to have a matching requirement. But for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, it has been around since 1965. It is most likely not going to go away. The funds are appropriated by Congress, and they are sent to the states by formula. They are actually called entitlement funds, which means you are going to get those funds. If the state makes a decision that it does not want those funds to flow through the state, then they will flow directly to the local school district, but the state will be responsible for monitoring and making sure that the funds are spent in the manner in which they were intended. Does that answer your question.
That's good, yeah.
Very
Any other questions? That's good. All right. Yes, sir. Superintendent Wilson, yes, sir.
As a follow-up to that, it really, my practical experience on that has been that the ramifications, and I think this is where it sort of comes down to compliance, and we start getting into the weeds on some of the things I think Dr. Rivas was saying. The money's allocated to the state, but at the system level, the practical aspect is it's getting more and more complicated. And I think this is just, call it bureaucracy or whatever it is. The practical application of being able to be flexible and agile as we want our students to be able to do, we want our teachers to be able to do, but when you get to that lowest common denominator of the system not being able to be agile in relation to the use of those funds for strategic value in relation to the unique needs of that culture and that community, that's where the long-term effect becomes, ultimately you guys are forced to say, sorry, you're not complying, therefore you don't get the money. Now, you take away 12% of our funding, which is what we use for strategic human capital development and those kind of things. The long-term effect is an immediate incapacitation is what it is. So it's a huge issue. And that's not an accusation or blame toward anyone.
Yes.
It's a critical point in terms of the ability to maneuver in terms of the strategic purpose of what we're trying to do with public education. I think it has a huge role in this discussion, in my opinion. So,
As Representative Glanton said, and you just said, I think that's exactly what we said earlier. This is, the governor knows that we need to, that's why I wanted to spend some time on it. We need to look at all of these things and what implication it does have. That's right. Thank you.
So I would like to respond just to make sure that we're
Yes.
all on the same page.
Yes, ma'am.
So I understand clearly what you're saying. Basically, the entitlement money, I'm not talking about
Right.
the competitive money
Right.
that we would apply, but for Title I, which is the money that we give or get for students that are in poverty, or Title IIA that we get to make sure every teacher now is a highly effective teacher. They come with requirements, and those requirements are actually written into the legislation.
Right.
So it's around every grant that you get. But there is another part, and I think that's what he was mentioning. The other part is the compliance piece. And there are two compliance agencies that we have to think about whenever you have federal money. One is the U.S. Department of Education, because they monitor the state and they ask, did you spend this money in the way that you were supposed to? Or did you ensure the district spent the money in the manner in which they were supposed to, or in accordance with what's in the law? The other agency has nothing to do with just the U.S. Department of Education. It is the Office of Management and Budget. And that is the office that looks at overall, it has overall requirements about how do you spend taxpayers' dollars. And so what happens is a state agency has to figure out what does it look like to provide tutoring to students. And so they create a set of what you may call rules or regulations around what that might look like. And then the other part is we cannot take money, entitlement money away from districts. I just want to make sure we're clear about this. However, we can, as a state, determine that it was not spent appropriately, and so we can ask that that money is returned. And then you also have the state auditors or your private auditors that are auditing that money as well. They have a set of accounting standards that they have to apply, and they may say that the money is not spent in the way that it should. So I clearly do understand what he's saying. And my last comment is this. I want you to know that that's how we ended up with the flexibility waiver. As a state, one of the roles that we play is to advocate on behalf of our local school districts for the flexibility that they are requesting. So we hear what your concerns are. It wasn't maybe a year, it wasn't even quite a year that Dr. Barge had become the superintendent that he asked to meet so that we could talk about the federal requirements. And I know that we have had conversations with the U.S. Department of Education around the flexibility. So we didn't just get the flexibility for the ESEA waiver. We had to advocate for it at the Georgia Department of Education. But I do get what you're saying.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Okay.
Yes, Dr. Barr.
I do want to clarify one thing. I believe somebody asked me the question about the percentage. The $1 billion that we receive in federal funds is what Clara was talking about as far as Title I, Perkins, and special ed.
The
That $1
entitlement.
billion does not include the school nutrition.
Correct.
And I think I misspoke.
Does not include the what?
The school nutrition fund.
I got you. Oh, it does not,
It
okay.
does not.
All right.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. All right, at this time, there's been a lot of questions on this topic, so we want to listen very carefully. I'd like to ask the Deputy Superintendent, Susan Andrews, if she would come forward and talk with us about Race to the Top and how it's attached to federal, how it's attached to Common Core.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me to come today. And committee members, it's great to be here to talk to you about Race to the Top. I know there have been a lot of questions about it and a lot of misconceptions about it, a lot of myths surrounding it. So I hope I can clear some of that up for you today. Ms. Keith talked about the two types of federal grants, the formula grants and the competitive grants. Race to the Top is a federal competitive grant. That means that Georgia chose to apply for a Race to the Top grant. It was not, we weren't commanded, we weren't directed, we chose